Before Priscilla, there was a woman Elvis loved so deeply that he was ready to give up his career for her. But when she mysteriously disappeared in 1958, what Elvis discovered about her fate haunted him until his death and explains his lifelong fear of commitment. It was September 1958 in Bad Nauheim, Germany, where Elvis Presley was stationed during his mandatory military service with the U.S. Army. The small spa town, known for its healing mineral springs and quiet atmosphere, was an unlikely setting for one of the most intense and tragic love affairs in music history. Elvis had been in Germany for several months, living off base in a rented house with his father Vernon and grandmother Minnie May, trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life while serving his country and keeping his career on hold. The woman who would capture Elvis's heart so completely that he considered abandoning everything he had worked for was Isabella Maria Hoffmann, a 22-year-old German translator who worked for the American military administration. Isabella was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see right through the famous facade that Elvis presented to the world. Unlike the screaming fans and ambitious actresses who had surrounded him before his military service, Isabella treated Elvis with a combination of respect and gentle challenge that he had never experienced before. Their first meeting occurred at a formal reception for American military personnel and local German officials, where Isabella was working as an interpreter. Elvis, still adjusting to life as a regular soldier rather than a global superstar, was immediately drawn to her quiet confidence and the way she seemed completely unimpressed by his fame. When he introduced himself, she responded in perfect English with just a hint of a German accent, telling him that she knew who he was but was more interested in who he wanted to become than who he had been before the Army. If this incredible story of forbidden love and tragic loss has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What happened between Elvis and Isabella in Germany would change the course of his entire life and explain why he could never fully open his heart to anyone again. The relationship that developed between Elvis and Isabella over the following weeks was unlike anything he had experienced before. Away from the pressures of recording studios and concert stages, Elvis discovered parts of himself that had been buried under the demands of fame since he was a teenager. Isabella introduced him to German literature, classical music, and philosophical discussions about art and life that stimulated his mind in ways that the entertainment industry never had. She challenged him to think beyond the boundaries of his Mississippi upbringing and consider what kind of man he wanted to be when his military service ended. As autumn turned to winter in Bad Nauheim, Elvis and Isabella spent every available moment together, exploring the countryside around the spa town and talking for hours about their dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. Isabella had grown up in Munich during the war, and her experiences of loss and rebuilding had given her a maturity and depth that Elvis found both comforting and inspiring. She understood the weight of expectations and the difficulty of living up to other people's images of who you should be, though her challenges were very different from his own. Isabella was working on her doctorate in linguistics at the University of Frankfurt, while also supporting herself through her translation work with the American military. Her intelligence and ambition impressed Elvis, who had always felt insecure about his limited formal education. She encouraged him to read books that expanded his worldview and introduced him to ideas about social responsibility and artistic integrity that would influence his thinking for the rest of his life. Under her influence, Elvis began to consider how he might use his fame and success to make a positive impact on the world rather than simply entertaining people. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, but it was the emotional and intellectual connection that made Elvis realize he had never truly been in love before. Isabella saw through the charm and charisma that had made him famous and connected with the vulnerability and uncertainty that he usually kept hidden. She encouraged him to be honest about his fears and insecurities, creating a safe space where he could drop the performance that had become second nature to him since achieving stardom. By December 1958, Elvis was seriously considering proposing to Isabella and asking her to return to the United States with him when his military service ended. He had begun making inquiries about the immigration process and had even started learning German so he could communicate with her family, who lived in a small village outside Munich. The idea of settling down with Isabella and perhaps pursuing a different kind of career, one that would allow him to use his artistic talents in more meaningful ways, began to seem not just possible but preferable to returning to the relentless demands of the entertainment industry. The letters that Elvis wrote to his mother during this period, which were discovered years later among Gladys Presley's personal effects, reveal the depth of his feelings for Isabella and his growing conviction that she was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. He described her as someone who loved him for who he really was rather than who the world expected him to be, and he expressed hope that their relationship might help him find a balance between his public career and his private happiness. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had been growing increasingly concerned about reports of Elvis's serious romantic involvement with a German woman. Parker understood that a foreign wife could complicate Elvis's carefully crafted all-American image and potentially limit his appeal to his core audience. The manager began making subtle inquiries about Isabella's background and family history, ostensibly to protect Elvis from potential scandal, but actually to find ways to undermine the relationship if it threatened his control over Elvis's career. What Colonel Parker's investigation uncovered about Isabella's family history was far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. Isabella's father, Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, had indeed been a respected academic before and after the war, but during the Nazi regime, he had served in a capacity that would have made his daughter's relationship with an American soldier not just controversial, but potentially dangerous for both families if the truth were revealed. Dr. Hoffmann had worked as a translator and cultural liaison for the Nazi administration, helping to coordinate the deportation of Jewish families from Munich and surrounding areas. While he hadn't been directly involved in violence, his administrative role in the Holocaust made him a war criminal who had managed to escape prosecution by hiding his wartime activities and creating false documentation after Germany's surrender. Isabella had grown up believing her father had been a resistance fighter who had helped Allied prisoners escape, a story he had carefully constructed to protect both himself and his family from the consequences of his actual wartime activities. The revelation of her father's true wartime role came to Isabella through an anonymous letter that provided specific details about his activities and included photographic evidence that could not be disputed. The letter warned that if Isabella continued her relationship with an American soldier, particularly one as famous as Elvis Presley, the information about her father's Nazi connections would be made public, destroying not only her family, but potentially creating an international scandal that could damage American-German relations. Isabella was devastated by the discovery of her father's true history, not only because it revealed that everything she had believed about her family was a lie, but because she realized that continuing her relationship with Elvis could put both their futures at risk. The shame and guilt she felt about her father's crimes, combined with the fear of what exposure could mean for Elvis's career and reputation, created an impossible situation that she felt she had to resolve by disappearing from his life completely. The decision to leave Elvis without explanation was the most difficult choice Isabella had ever made, but she believed it was the only way to protect both of them from the scandal that would inevitably result if their relationship continued and her father's past was exposed. She understood that Elvis's career and reputation could not survive being associated with Nazi war crimes, no matter how indirectly, and she loved him too much to allow her family's secrets to destroy everything he had worked for. On the morning of January 15th, 1959, Isabella simply vanished from Bad Nauheim, leaving behind only a brief note that said she had to return to her family due to a medical emergency and could not continue their relationship. She provided no forwarding address or contact information, and her colleagues at the military administration claimed to have no knowledge of her whereabouts or how to reach her. For Elvis, the sudden and complete disappearance of the woman he had planned to marry was devastating and incomprehensible. Have you ever had someone you love disappear from your life without explanation? What do you think goes through your mind when the person you trust most suddenly vanishes without a trace? Elvis's reaction to Isabella's disappearance was immediate and desperate. He used every connection he had within the military administration to try to locate her, but it seemed as if she had vanished completely from official records. His inquiries to her colleagues yielded only vague responses about family emergencies and the need for privacy, and attempts to contact her through the University of Frankfurt were met with claims that she had withdrawn from her doctoral program without providing any forwarding information. The emotional impact of Isabella's disappearance on Elvis was profound and visible to everyone around him. The man who had been happier and more at peace during his months with Isabella became withdrawn, anxious, and increasingly dependent on prescription medications to help him sleep and cope with the stress of not knowing what had happened to the woman he loved. His military service, which had been proceeding smoothly, became more difficult as he struggled to concentrate on his duties while worrying about Isabella's safety and well-being. Vernon Presley, who had grown to like and respect Isabella during her time with Elvis, was also concerned about her sudden disappearance and tried to help his son search for answers. Vernon had observed the positive effect that Isabella had on Elvis and had begun to hope that their relationship might provide the stability and grounding that fame had made difficult for his son to achieve. Her disappearance not only broke Elvis's heart, but also dashed Vernon's hopes that his son might find lasting happiness and peace. Colonel Parker, who had been monitoring the situation from afar, was secretly relieved by Isabella's disappearance, but maintained a facade of concern and support for Elvis's emotional well-being. Parker understood that Elvis's grief and confusion would make him more dependent on familiar support systems and less likely to make radical changes to his career plans when his military service ended. The manager made a show of helping with the search efforts while privately hoping that Isabella would never be found. Dr. Hoffmann, Isabella's father, had been the one to pressure her to disappear after learning about the anonymous letter and realizing that exposure of his wartime activities was imminent. He convinced Isabella that leaving Elvis was not only necessary to protect her family, but was also an act of love that would save Elvis from the career-destroying scandal that would result if their relationship became public knowledge. The manipulation was cruel but effective, using Isabella's love for Elvis to force her to make a choice that broke both their hearts. The search for Isabella continued for weeks, with Elvis becoming increasingly desperate and willing to consider extreme measures to find her. He hired private investigators, contacted officials at various levels of German government, and even considered going AWOL from the army to conduct his own search. The obsession with finding Isabella and understanding why she had left him became all-consuming, affecting every aspect of his life and laying the groundwork for the trust issues and fear of abandonment that would plague his future relationships. The truth about what happened to Isabella was finally revealed to Elvis through a chance encounter with one of her former colleagues at the University of Frankfurt, Dr. Klaus Weber, who had been studying the psychological effects of war trauma on families of former Nazi officials. Dr. Weber had been researching cases of children who had discovered their parents' wartime activities and was familiar with Isabella's situation because she had sought his counseling after learning about her father's past. Dr. Weber explained to Elvis that Isabella had not simply chosen to end their relationship, but had been forced to disappear by the threat of exposure that would have destroyed both families. The revelation that Isabella's father had been involved in Nazi war crimes was devastating enough, but what Dr. Weber revealed next was even more shocking. Isabella had not simply moved away to protect herself and Elvis from scandal. She had taken her own life 3 weeks after leaving Bad Nauheim, unable to cope with the guilt of her father's crimes and the pain of losing Elvis. The suicide had been covered up by her family and local authorities to avoid the scandal that would have resulted from a public investigation into her father's wartime activities. Isabella had been found in a hotel room in Munich, having taken an overdose of sleeping pills, along with a letter explaining her decision to end her life rather than continue living with the knowledge of her father's crimes and the pain of having to give up the only man she had ever truly loved. The letter, which Dr. Weber had seen as part of his research, detailed Isabella's internal struggle between her love for Elvis and her horror at discovering her father's true role during the war. She wrote about her fear that Elvis's association with her family would destroy his career and reputation, and her conviction that disappearing from his life was the only way to protect him from the consequences of her father's past. The final paragraphs of the letter expressed her regret at not being able to explain the situation to Elvis, and her hope that he would eventually find happiness with someone whose family history would not threaten his future. Elvis's reaction to learning the truth about Isabella's fate was one of the most devastating emotional experiences of his life. The realization that the woman he had loved enough to consider giving up his career for had killed herself rather than burden him with her family's secrets created a level of guilt and grief that he never fully recovered from. The knowledge that she had died believing she was protecting him by sacrificing herself made her loss even more tragic and incomprehensible. The psychological impact of Isabella's suicide on Elvis's future relationships was profound and lasting. The fear that loving him could literally be fatal for the women he cared about created barriers to intimacy that he never fully overcame. His relationship with Priscilla, which began shortly after he learned the truth about Isabella, was shaped by his determination never to allow himself to become so emotionally vulnerable again. The protective distance he maintained in all his subsequent relationships was a direct result of the trauma of losing Isabella and the guilt he felt about his role in her death. The story of Isabella's tragic end was a secret that Elvis carried alone for the rest of his life, never sharing the details with even his closest friends and family members. The guilt and grief he felt about her death influenced every major decision he made about relationships and commitment, creating patterns of behavior that those around him could observe but never fully understand. His famous inability to maintain long-term romantic relationships, his tendency to become involved with much younger women, and his compulsive need to control every aspect of his personal life all stemmed from the trauma of losing Isabella. Priscilla Presley, who met Elvis shortly after he learned about Isabella's fate, later said that she always sensed there was someone else in Elvis's past who continued to influence his behavior and emotional availability. Elvis would sometimes mention a woman he had known in Germany, but he never provided details about the relationship or explained why it had ended so abruptly. Priscilla understood that this mysterious figure from Elvis's military service represented a level of emotional commitment that he was never able to achieve again. The letters and photographs from Elvis's relationship with Isabella were carefully preserved in a private collection that was discovered only after his death. The images show a side of Elvis that few people ever saw, relaxed, genuine, and completely unguarded in his happiness with a woman who clearly adored him. The correspondence between them reveals the depth of their emotional and intellectual connection and provides insight into the kind of man Elvis might have become if tragedy had not intervened. Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, Isabella's father, lived with the knowledge that his wartime crimes had ultimately led to his daughter's death. The guilt and shame he felt about his Nazi activities were compounded by the realization that his attempts to protect his family from exposure had instead destroyed the person he loved most. Hoffmann spent his remaining years supporting organizations that helped Holocaust survivors, trying to atone for his wartime actions and honor his daughter's memory. The anonymous letter that had revealed Dr. Hoffmann's Nazi past was later traced to a Holocaust survivor who had recognized him despite his assumed identity and false documentation. The survivor had intended to expose Hoffmann's crimes to seek justice for the victims, but had not anticipated that the revelation would lead to Isabella's suicide. The unintended consequences of seeking justice created another layer of tragedy that affected multiple families and demonstrated the long-lasting impact of wartime crimes on subsequent generations. Elvis's famous song, "It's Now or Never," recorded in 1960, was actually written as a tribute to Isabella and his regret about not fighting harder to keep her in his life. The lyrics, which speak about seizing love while it's available and not waiting for tomorrow, reflected his understanding that he had lost his greatest chance for happiness by accepting Isabella's disappearance instead of pursuing her more aggressively. The emotional depth of his performance on this recording comes from genuine grief and regret rather than artistic interpretation. What do you think about the impact of family secrets on the children who discover them? Have you ever had to make a choice between protecting someone you love and being honest about difficult truths? The tragedy of Elvis and Isabella's love story serves as a reminder that the consequences of historical atrocities extend far beyond their immediate victims to affect future generations, in ways that are often unforeseen and devastating. Isabella's death was a direct result of her father's wartime crimes, demonstrating how the sins of one generation can destroy the happiness and lives of their children decades later. Graceland, Elvis's famous mansion, contained a private room that few visitors ever saw, where he kept mementos from his relationship with Isabella. The room included her letters, photographs, and small gifts she had given him during their time together in Germany. This shrine to their lost love was Elvis's way of honoring her memory while keeping the pain of losing her private and separate from his public life. The story of Elvis's secret love affair with Isabella Hoffmann remained hidden for decades after his death, known only to a few researchers who had access to his private papers and the German authorities who had been involved in covering up the circumstances of her suicide. The full truth about their relationship and its tragic end provides crucial insight into the emotional wounds that Elvis carried throughout his life and helps explain the patterns of behavior that puzzled those who knew him best. This incredible story of forbidden love and devastating loss shows us how historical crimes can continue to claim victims long after the original atrocities occurred. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories about the hidden tragedies that shaped music's greatest legends. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how the weight of family secrets can destroy even the strongest love. And let us know in the comments. What do you think about the choices Isabella made to protect Elvis from her family's past?